Welcome. I'm Susanna Grego. I direct public engagement for the Skoll Foundation, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to our Future of Media session focusing on the influence and ethics of social media platforms. In this session, we'll hear from speakers about the influence and power that social media platforms wield, but we'll also try to unpack the responsibility that that brings, and also discuss how best to balance those responsibilities with the freedom of expression. We designed this panel to grapple with a really small topic on the future of the digital public square. This is just the beginning of that conversation, and there couldn't be a more important time to do this, especially given the developments over the last few days. This session will be moderated by Connie Sehat. The two hats she wears allow her to address the challenges of misinformation and the quality of news. As director of the NewsFrames initiative at Global Voices, Connie is developing resources, software, and data sets for collaborative media analysis. And as a contributor to the Credibility Coalition, she's developing an indicator schema for reliable information and is testing that application on news articles. So as you can see, we couldn't be in more knowledgeable hands and in for a more important discussion. Thanks so much, and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you very much. It's on. Keep on talking. Oh, there it goes. Welcome to this session. We're so glad that many of you were able to join us here today, which we hope will be a very dynamic and sort of informative, maybe even a little fun as a conversation. So what I'm going to do for our lovely, just really feel privileged to be trying to have a conversation with all of these people at once in a very short period of time. We're going to do our best. What I'd like to do for us, though, to begin with is just to sort of set the stage a little bit. So I want to help kind of like start with some terms so we don't have to spend time on that. And then I get to sort of ask lovely questions of our panel. So just to kind of kick things off, of course, there's the terms fake news, propaganda, misinformation, disinformation. It kind of runs the gamut. So for right now, I think just in terms of trying to kind of maybe be very specific about some of the terminologies, if you haven't seen this wonderful slide from firstdraftnews.org, it's kind of a proposal, especially by Clara to kind of consider what's going on right now in the ecosystem as information disorder. And so I love these terminologies in terms of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, where you can kind of see on the one side, yes, false news, sometimes what people call fake news, but also this other sphere of intent to harm, which can actually, in fact, be true, right? So in terms of conscious leaks, this is trying to kind of like, maybe more, specifically define some of the problems that we're facing when we want to use a blanket term. So just kicking it off with that, but also just wanting to share a little bit about perhaps some of the scope of the problems that we're seeing. I share this one example, an article which, according to BuzzSumo, was shared 1.9 million times in the last year. And this title, Johns Hopkins researcher releases shocking report on flu vaccines. Well, let me say a few things through our research at the Credibility Coalition. One, there's a dispute as to whether or not it's a Johns Hopkins researcher, whether the report was really shocking, or if it in fact had anything to do with flu vaccines. I'll give you a hint, actually, the writer was an anthropologist. And yet it was shared, as I said, 1.9 million times last year. So we know that there's this problem in terms of just the reach that certain kinds of information can have. What about another kind of scale? This is a map based on a research report that we did at NewsFrames. There was an image that I didn't want to share because it is actually a trigger warning. It's a violent image that originated out of the Democratic Republic of Congo in the year 2010. It showed victims of a horrible, horrible tanker accident explosion. And what our collaborative team of journalists did was they traced the story. And they traced it since 2010, it being shared in at least 20 different countries, but in two different formats that you may not expect. First, it was used to portray perhaps victims of Boko Haram violence in Nigeria. And the second was that it was used to perhaps be as proof for Rohingya Muslims being killed. So two different very strong narratives since 2010, evidence in at least 20 different countries of it being shared, not just on, say, Facebook or Twitter, but also evidence of it being sent out through mailings, posted on forum, and then jumping back into social media spaces. So again, just to kind of think about the scale, especially as we think about this particular forum on the power of proximity of what we're trying to do when we try to address this very small, focused panel on social media ethics. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump in. I would like to start off with this question. Is there something significantly different about the nature of misinformation, disinformation, or propaganda now? In other words, isn't this kind of an old human problem? And I'd like to ask Tim maybe to kick us off.
Sure, definitely. I mean, I think that the phenomenon that you're seeing, right, which is strategic use of misinformation to try to shape the public sphere, is not new, right? You know, I think you can think about it both in terms of its sort of general environmental impact, right? Like, have rumors existed in the past? The answer is definitely yes. But I think you can also make that claim stronger, which is like, have people deployed these techniques in intentional ways to try to manipulate the public sphere? And I think the answer there is yes as well. I would say there's kind of two things that strike me about what's sort of unique maybe about the current generation of disinformation. First one is that a lot of disinformation or propaganda campaigns that we've seen in the past, for example, leafleting, right, or propaganda radio broadcasts, they have a very broad sort of public envelope. You know when someone's committing these campaigns because there are suddenly papers kind of falling from the sky. And I think what's interesting about these types of campaigns is that they can be a lot more targeted and a lot more subtle, and they can take place sort of without kind of public knowledge, right? And in the past, you could execute on that sort of thing, but it was considerably more expensive to pull off and considerably more difficult to kind of target effectively. So I think that's one big difference. The second big difference in my mind is sort of this kind of quantification that we now have. And maybe this kind of goes to the question of sort of like, can we actually understand what is going on? So there's a famous remark in the world of marketing, the Wanamaker principle, right, which says 50% of the marketing that I spend is wasted. I just don't know which half of it is. Mm-hmm. And I actually wonder a little bit more about, like, both in terms of detecting these campaigns, but also executing on them, whether or not the ability to kind of quantify social behavior, predict social behavior, and then make decisions based on that actually makes these campaigns potentially more pernicious and effective than they used to be in the past. And so I think there's more differences we could point out, but I think those are two maybe just to get us rolling.
Okay, great. Does anyone have an addition to that in terms of the particularity of that problem right now? Yes, go ahead, please, Kelly.
Well, I completely agree with Tim on the point around the sort of micro-targeting, and would add to that sort of the precision and the cost effectiveness of the micro-targeting that's pretty unprecedented. In addition, just the role of bots and the ability to have sort of artificial amplification of ideas that might be really fringe or extreme, but are somehow distorted to be viewed as really mainstream because they're able to amplify them. I think the complete removal of gatekeepers, you know, I think we've always had at least someone controlling the printing press or the airwaves or something like that. And so this removal of gatekeepers that makes it really hard for citizens to understand the quality of the information that they've been exposed to or the source of it. And I guess the last one that I would add that's sort of related to that is just the overwhelming amount of information, right? The ability to make sense of and understand, or even feel like you want to understand what is out there, or just sort of throw your hands up just because there's such a huge volume now.
Yeah. So I would add, I mean, Tim is thinking of it mostly from the bot and the algorithm end of things. I am thinking about it in terms of the relationship between news, the public, and the distribution system that has been broken. So it's true that these things have been going on a long time. News industry has been struggling with problems of trust since at least the late 90s. And there are communities that haven't been very well covered by the news over time. But what we're seeing now is a big shift in values and a misplacement of values, as well as the power equation. So what's different now, and I founded the Trust Project because this kind of thing was coming up. Editors were anticipating that the distribution of news on the digital platforms was really shifting and putting pressure on news in unforeseen ways. So it was the algorithms were emphasizing emotion, were emphasizing novelty, and as a result, journalistic values about authority and about quality were disappearing. And so the idea of the Trust Project is how can we flip the picture and reinstate sort of recalibrate algorithms and also the relationship with the public to re-emphasize authority and this relationship of trust with the public, which I think gets to what Kelly was talking about, which is, this is the other thing that has changed a lot recently, is the public essentially has abdicated power over the information they're gathering to social media and to search. So rather than taking responsibility for absorbing news, sharing news, in many cases we hear people just throwing up their hands, or just we see people throwing up their hands and just saying and being very uncertain about what they're getting and what to do with it. And
Sally,
whether to trust
this
it.
is a perfect segue actually to my next question, and I'd love for you to be able to answer this as well. So how well do you think people are capable of judging information quality right now as a whole? Can they be given enough good information to make these decisions?
Yeah, well, that's the perfect question for me. You're right, because the whole idea of the Trust Project is founded upon the idea that the people are capable of making that decision. And I mean, that is the traditional relationship of journalism to the public, is enabling the public to make decisions about their lives, their communities, their governments. So yes, the public is able to do that. And what we did when I started the Trust Project, which is hosted by the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University, we started talking to people and asked them about what is it you value in the news, when do you trust it, when don't you? And what we were able to find is that, first of all, there are four different types of people if you think about them in the way that they consume news. One is the avid news user. So they're out there looking for news, checking it, cross-checking it, pushing it out through their networks, definitely making that assessment. There's the engaged news user who is cares about the news and probably subscribes to different or gets the news from various places, but feels overwhelmed and often underrepresented in the news and talks about it with the other people. Then there's the opportunistic. The news just sort of flows over them. And there we found a lot of uncertainty, especially. And then you have the angry and disaffected. And those might be the same as the avid, because they're also checking the news, except they're checking it out of their own partisan bubble. So what we see, and this was research across the US and Europe primarily, and it was design-focused research, so it's not like academic research by any sense. It was aimed to help us understand the public and then work with that in order to create a set of trust indicators. And the trust indicators were then developed out of, with news executives from 75 news organizations in workshops that then looked at this research and came up with 8 things to show the public to help them make those decisions. Mm-hmm. And just as an example, one of the things were, well, what are the values and commitments behind journalism that make journalism distinct? And one of those things is a commitment to ethics, which is avoiding conflict of interest, bringing a commitment to accuracy, a commitment to avoiding having an agenda or a purpose behind journalism other than to inform and allow the public to make their own decisions. And then there's some other things too. But the thought is that if you give people the information that they need and become more transparent about the way journalism works, then they will be enabled to go ahead and sort through this huge onslaught of information that we're getting. And if you don't have that kind of information, it's very easy to mistake propaganda for news, to mistake advertising for news, because it's all kind of looks the same. And that's why these news organizations that are working with us are now presenting these trust indicators on their sites so people can actually look at a piece of news and say, okay, not only, and maybe it kind of looks the same in form and structure, but I can see there's information about the byline. I can see there's information about the site and who owns it. And it's labeled news, analysis, opinion, or paid content.
So to follow up this question, and I know that perhaps Laura and also Tim might want to jump in here, let me go ahead and also broaden the scope, because I think this is wonderful in terms of understanding more what could happen in the journalism space in terms of trust indicators. But I think one of the things that digital media, social media has done is really democratize the spectrum of producers. User-generated content, for example, is one thing that I'm thinking about in the background. So maybe Laura and then Tim first, your thoughts.
Yeah, I want to sort of broaden as well to kind of think about how there's different actors. It goes back to kind of your first slide of both what is the sort of nature and intent of the information and also who's the actor behind it. So I'm thinking about this from the perspective of adversarial governments that are using information essentially as a weapon to undermine democratic institutions, to create chaos or interfere in politics of other countries, as well as to control their own citizenry in some cases. And I think that presents a different set of challenges or a complex set of challenges that overlay on some of these. So I do think that context matters enormously. And with context and with the right kind of information cues, users really can make some kinds of evaluations. But I also think that thinking about governments like Russia, China, who are using, as Tim and Kelly said, these really low-cost kinds of mechanisms where you can, throw a bunch of spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks, and it's not very expensive. And if you get caught, if you're Putin, who cares? I think that presents a whole different set of challenges when you're dealing with essentially a nation state that has the capability to undertake a whole suite of tools. I'll give an example of one of the things that this is one of my favorite tricks lately. The other day I went to Google News and I searched just two very banal search terms, Russia, NATO. That was the only thing I searched, Google News. The third and the fifth story that came up in the ranking third was RT, the fifth was Sputnik. The Sputnik article, very relevant to us here sitting in the UK right now, was NATO behind Skripal poisoning in order to justify defense spending. Fifth story on Google News search. So the user there is getting context clues that this is a highly rated news story on, again, search was very broad, Russia, NATO. And so that's the kind of contextual clues that are actually sort of misinforming the users, and I think we really need to kind of think about how do we ensure that those kinds of cues aren't being misdirected in a way that kind of gives prominence to something that's clearly propaganda. And so, I'm sure if a user sort of went through the kinds of markers you're talking about, Sally, would see, okay, maybe this is not something that I should value in my evaluation of news, but here Google News, who I trust, is putting it towards the top. But again, that's where you have a nation state that is clearly spending a lot of time thinking, how do I game this algorithm? How do I get my stuff to the top? And I think that that's a really specific set and very complicated set of challenges to wrestle with in this context as well.
Sure. Maybe I guess maybe another alternative way at the same problem is, I think we can think about, what are indicia that allow context or content to be trustworthy. Another way of asking it, I think, is also thinking about what makes content look trustworthy in context. Because I think one of the elements that we need to consider is sort of the economics of a trust signal, right? And the fact that it is low cost to, for example, get up very highly on an algorithm or replicate lots of the features of content that looks trustworthy is precisely part of the problem, right? You could imagine that we could actually specify that this is what trustworthy content looks like, but if it's easy for things to imitate that, right, then we've got a real problem on our hands. So it ends up being this kind of dual set problem of both defining what we're shooting after, but also defining a set of indexes, or indicia rather, that are very difficult to print counterfeit versions of. And that's partially mediated by the algorithms, but also partially mediated by this very, I think, human-computer interaction aspect of, what does it actually look like, right? If there's a commitment to ethics, what does that look like on its surface? And how do we define that in very concrete terms?
I want to come a little bit more back to this role of the platforms and also with Nick, but pause for just a second first to ask a question of Kelly, and also to tell you guys that I hope to basically cut our session a little short so that we can open it up for your questions too, because I'm sure that you guys have many good ones. Kelly, regardless though, do you think that, given some of these thoughts about propaganda, do you think that users, that individuals still need to be given some kind of choice in this, however optimistic you may or may not feel about the individual's ability to perceive quality information in a democratically sort of, if you have democratic values, do you need to give them some kind of choice? Or how does that happen?
I certainly am not going to go on the record saying that users shouldn't have a choice.
Yes, we are taping.
We all, as a user, also would like to have, right? But I think you're right. I have been skeptical of putting the burden solely or even primarily on citizens. I mean, the reality is we are all really busy. We are overwhelmed. There's a lot going on. There's a ton of information flooding at us. We can't get half of Americans to vote in presidential elections, much less primaries. Very clear evidence that most people don't read past the headlines before they share things. So I think while in a hopeful mind frame, I would like to say that we could help citizens, give citizens the tools to solve it. I think that can be part of the solution, but I think if we're putting all of our eggs in that basket, given what we know about how citizens engage with politics and democracy, I don't think that that's going to solve the problem. I mean, they're overwhelmed, and you just look at the behavioral science around how citizens engage with content that reaffirms their pre-existing world. I mean, that is exactly what citizens have been demonstrated again and again that we like. We like news that reaffirms our pre-existing worldviews, that reinforces our tribal identities. We like it 20% more if it's emotionally, charged and it sort of inspires, and the novelty pieces that others have mentioned. So I think we can't assume that citizens are going to solve this problem on their own.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, I want to hear from Nick, and then I want
Well, actually, so this is a good segue because I think we've been kind of thinking about the problem aspect here, kind of trying to give a little bit more character depth to the sort of different ways that we can conceive of this problem. So, but I want to try and do, as Kelly has already suggested, is think about solutions, right? Like, what does this actually mean we're here at the Skoll World Forum, how are we going to do this? Nick, I just wanted to know, do you have any thoughts perhaps about what the role of the platforms could be, like in terms of ameliorating or addressing these kinds of issues, which are ranging from malicious sort of intent to also just uninformed information, et cetera, so forth.
No, totally, and thank you for the invitation. It's always great to be the only industry person on a panel, which seems to keep happening. But I think so the challenge of doing panels like this when you have such great speakers is that you double the amount of things you want to say, which then makes you more confused about what to focus on. But I think the issues we've touched on are really important here, because I think it's about, there's an ethical framework around intervention of platforms and what we do and what we tell our users that we have to be very, very careful around. And I think that point about cognitive bias is really important here. It's very easy to think that this problem is about fake and not about hyperpartisan. And actually, one of the dangers of a hyperpartisan information discussion is that if we intervene in that, any intervention will look biased. It risks being perceived as biased, therefore weakens its impact. Particularly around elections, you're intervening in political speech. So someone may share a viewpoint which, in evidential terms, doesn't stand up, is coming from a very aggressive, very negative political space. But as a platform intervening in that conversation, when a real person shares a real piece of content with a real person, intervening in that is very, very different to intervening where a bot is trying to amplify something. So I think from a platform point of view, the reason why projects like the Trust Project are really important is it gets you a level above looking at individual pieces of content and looks at how can we establish the credibility of actors. So I think, we for a long time had the verification process where you got a blue tick next to an account, which became a really important indicator of this person is who they say they are, which at the core of what we're discussing here is really important, because most of the actors that you saw in that diagram, particularly the ones in the malinformation and disinformation space, are trying to obfuscate their behavior, their identity to some extent. And if we can inform people of who they are and give them in context to explain who they are, that addresses some of the problem. It doesn't address all of it, because then it does put information in people's hands. We as platforms then have to stop manipulation. And so that's where bots are really important, because it gave an inauthentic signal of credibility, because someone had a lot of followers, a tweet had a lot of retweets, and that gave an ordinary user an indicator of, that looks like this account is credible. And that credibility was manufactured, it was inauthentic, and it was using manipulative techniques. So we as platforms have to make sure you can't manipulate our systems to look more credible than you are. We also then have to figure out how to give users useful information. I think one of the dangers in the current environment is give users more information, ends up being a bit like a food nutrition label. Is there's so much information there, it's not actually useful. So I think the challenge for platforms is meaningful and useful information about context and credibility. Make sure the behavior on our platforms is authentic, and where people are trying to manipulate inauthentic behavior, we take them off our platforms. But then we also become part of the bigger public conversation, which is, and public diplomacy is an underused phrase these days, but actually one of the challenges is if you have an information vacuum, bad actors will fill that vacuum. And so part of the solution here isn't just about removal of content, it's also about increasing content from credible sources. And I think governments actually have a really big part to play in that. And often in this conversation, the actors are perceived to be news outlets, tech companies, and users, and we don't often talk about governments. But they have a really, really important role to play here.
So, Laura, hold his thoughts in your head, because I'm going to come back to you. But Sally, please.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of correct a perception maybe that, so when I talk about the Trust Project, or when I started talking about it to this audience, I really emphasized the user experience element, because I know many of you are working directly with populations who can have an impact and can be empowered by things like the trust indicators. It actually is, though, an interactive system where not only are news organizations declaring to the public who they are and what work went into an article and what their commitments are, but they're also declaring that through consistent markup to platforms including Twitter, Google, Bing, and Facebook. How could I have forgotten them? And the truth is, I didn't know this, but they were getting all kinds of crazy markup from news organizations that was not consistent at all, because everyone was trying to game the SEO. So one of the things we're doing is making sure that the language is the same, and I know, Connie, you're working on this too, but we're working with schema.org so that the language that news organizations are putting in their code is something that the algorithms can read and that are supporting this assessment of authority, of trustworthiness, of authenticity. And the other thing about solutions, so that's the system we're creating. I just want to, while you're segueing into solutions, I think that the role that government can play, as Nick was raising, has to do with cultivating, as I see it, and there are many other roles, but cultivating a diverse, active media environment and avoiding consolidation and encouraging multiple voices. And just as Nick was saying, encouraging more quality information as opposed to, in the absence of quality, allowing all the misinformation to flourish.
Perfect. So, Laura, thinking about the role of governments, and specifically, I think also what Nick alluded to, but let me kind of flesh it out further, free speech, right? I mean, I think, in terms of US regulations or EU regulations, there are different variations about what free speech means. And I'm just trying to think through, like, what would the role of governments look like in this international, global space, right? With so many different kinds of values and so many different kinds of ways of thinking about what free speech equals. I don't know if you have any thoughts to offer.
So number one, I do come at the speech question from a very American perspective, so I will just table that up front, that I am, all about sort of defending the principles of our democracy that I believe are under attack from a lot of different vectors, and that means First Amendment is, I believe, one of the strongest pillars of American democracy, and so I view it as relatively sacred. So that is not a sort of global view necessarily of speech, and it is very different here in the EU, but just so you have a sense of where I'm coming at this from. But before I get to some of the specifics, the one thing I would like to say on that too is that governments like China that are using the information space, the tools we're talking about here, in a very different way to essentially control their entire population around the information space. I mean, there was a time when people thought the internet coming to China would actually be a source of openness and democratization, and in fact what we have seen is the Chinese Communist Party doing a really masterful job at figuring out how to just, the Great Firewall essentially really is truly a system of control. And using a lot of data technologies now to be able to really control and manipulate the entire Chinese population in some pretty scary ways. And so countries like China would love nothing more than for democratic countries to go all in on content regulation and speech. And so there's a lot of reasons why I think that's not the way to go. The things I do think need to be thought about in a number of different ways. One is there are some very specific things in the U.S. context where, whether it's around political advertising online, is something that falls sort of in a sort of loophole at the moment in our regulatory structure. That's a very small thing, but is an easy kind of thing. Should be easy. It is not easy in our US context, but is one thing. I do think that the US has not reckoned yet with questions of data and what it means for our citizenry. I don't think that GDPR is really applicable to the US context in a meaningful way, but I do think that a reckoning around questions of data will have to happen at some point. But I'm actually my own personal view is that regulation is not going to be the answer in this space. We're always going to end up regulating for the last problem rather than future problems. Technology is moving so quickly that I worry that we put in place, structures that will be fighting the last war. What I do think we need to have is two things, and one of these came out, I think, clearly yesterday in the hearing with Mark Zuckerberg, is that our elected officials, our government, is not really conversant on these issues in the way that they need to be. That's diplomatically put there. And so I think we do need the policy community, governments, to be much more literate about technology. We also need the technology community to be a little bit more literate about policy. And again, thinking about this from the perspective that I'm coming from of, if I'm a foreign government, how am I going to identify vulnerabilities in different societies that I can exploit to nefarious ends? I'm going to look for ways that things that have been created for good purposes could be weaponized and turned against societies. And that's basically what we've seen here. So how do we start to think about tech creation on the front end in a different way that can factor in some of these vulnerabilities before they're exploited? So a lot of that basically talks to not sort of regulatory government action, but rebuilding of trust and really better understanding sort of between the government and tech communities.
Terrific, thank you. Tim and then Kelly.
Sure, I'd love to pick up on that theme again, because I think as we think about the role of governments, one way of thinking about it is that there's almost two types of trust effects that we're dealing with, right? We can talk about the trust effect of bad content, right, and the trust effect of like bad methods. Because you imagine a world where everybody has access to these bots, and the bots only say true things all the time, but like the effect could have still actually been quite corrosive on the public sphere, right? And so, there's these multiple layers at which the government can intervene in, some which might make us more or less comfortable than others, right? Because I think certainly one where we say, actually we want the government to be in the role of basically verifying facts and distributing them as official facts feels a lot more, heavy in what that would imply than a world where it says we want to put pressure, for example, on platforms to do a much better job with bots, right? Or with other kind of methods of manipulation. And I think those are two types of trust effects, and we should think about what institutions line up really well or really poorly with trying to deal with one or the other of them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so I want to pull out a few things that were said that I thought were really important. Nick, I thought your distinction between fake news and sort of biased or uncivil content was a really important one. I think most people that are working in this space really won't even use the term fake news anymore. But I think it highlights that we haven't even as a community come to clarity around what is the problem that we're trying to solve, right? Much less how to even begin solving it. So we've all been to 5 of these conferences a month or a week sometime, right? And on this topic, and people in the room are all talking about different things: the decline of local journalism, journalistic revenue models, fake news. It's kind of all over the place. And so I think, but I think it is exactly right that fake news per se isn't the problem, and that the platforms are economically incentivized to solve that problem, but perhaps less incentivized to solve the problems of biased information that people like. So I thought that was a really important point. I think Tim and Laura, you touched on this too, to your points around what are the levers or levels of intervention. There's the content level, which makes people who are fans of free speech nervous, right? There's at the tool level that Tim was talking about, bots, and we could have different micro-targeting policies that say, in addition to not allowing targeting based on race or religion, you might also say that proxies for ideology, you couldn't micro-target on that. So there are sort of different tools that you could intervene around. And then, Nick, to the point that you brought up, there's the actor and the authenticity of the actor and sort of, who are the accounts or the people behind it. And I thought your point was interesting because it brings up one of the challenges here, which gets, Susanna, to some of the, the proximity question around in a democratic regime, verifying identity might make sense. You get into less democratic or authoritarian contexts where the minority voice is the democratic voice, right, and is going to then be attacked if their identity is revealed, right? So it just really speaks to the complexity of this problem in different geopolitical contexts, which I think is really an interesting one.
Thank you. So final question, just open to the panel to sort of help us maybe round this out and then open it up to the floor for questions is, yes, the solutions, right? It's even hard to articulate the nature of the problem, so how are we going to come up with solutions? But I think one of the things that I've been myself struggling with, trying to figure out how to reimagine is the public sphere. And the public sphere at an international level as well as a local level. And we've been talking a lot here at Skoll about how to be proximate. Right, so I'm just curious about approaches to what does it mean, especially I think, let me put my civil society hat on right now. Like, we've been talking about governments, we've been talking about professional organizations, we've been talking about platforms, but how do we nurture a civil society that's able to be a part of this solution? What does it mean to be proximate to this problem in order to create the solutions? And I feel like yes, this is the thing that I've been, some of you know, I've been spinning around for a while now. So I'd love to hear your latest thoughts on this.
I can start.
Yes.
So those of you who haven't seen, we issued a call for proposals a few weeks ago, talking about this concept of public health on Twitter, which we very deliberately didn't define too narrowly because we're actually interested in what other people think we should be measuring, rather than, I think sometimes as tech companies are prone to do, we sit in a room, we come up with something, and then we come out and say, hey, this isn't this wonderful? Tell us how wonderful it is. And turns out that doesn't always work. So that proposal process closes on Friday this week, so you have time to get proposals in if you want to. And I think that's very much come up with something that as well isn't platform specific. I think it's quite dangerous in this space where you build things that work on one platform and you can't read them out. It creates a whole range of issues that aren't good for society. I think the other thing that, that was inspired by Cortico, which is spun out of the MIT Media Lab. Those of you who haven't seen it, they've had some sort of 4 principles of public health, which are worth reading, and we've certainly found them very illuminating. I think the step back process for me is actually go way back to Ed Murrow. And when Ed Murrow was making films for the US Information Agency, there was a big argument in the US government about whether they should include civil rights issues in USIA films. And the argument was, well, if we tell people what our problems are, it undermines our argument. And Murrow's answer was no, if you don't tell people what the problems are, it'll look like you're glossing over and it looks like propaganda. And truth is the best propaganda, as many people have said. So I think one of the challenges we also have in this space is when we're talking about exploitation of division, is to not think those divisions only exist online. Actually, a lot of the things, and Brexit's a good example here, whether it's Le Pen, whether it's Trump, even what's happening in those of us who've met people who work for Rappler in the Philippines, for example, there are societal issues under the technology layer that even if you fix the technology layer, the division is still there and it'll be amplified in a different way. So when the Estonian government talks about this, they talk about money going into groups on the ground and think tanks. It's not about digital. And it's because it's driving at the same divisions. And I think there's a real danger that the policy conversation we're having right now is a bit surface layer, and we're not actually getting to that point of, are we talking about civil rights? Because I think in a lot of contexts, it's easy to talk about the technology, it's hard to talk about social issues.
Tim?
I think in some ways, having gone to a bunch of these conferences, I think sometimes we get locked into this narrative or this folk tale of like how we tell ourselves about what we're working on. And the notion is, okay, there's a series of problems, right? And we need to find the patch, right? Like the patch that will deal with the problem. And at the same time, we tend to be really uncomfortable about those patches because they have no expiration date, right? You basically put the patch in, you're like, but won't that lock civil society into a certain mode? Or like, do we really want to delegate power permanently to the platforms? And so I guess one approach I've been using is trying to think about like, what are other sort of like regulatory metaphors we can use? Like, what is this like conversational public sphere ecosystem that we're talking about? One that I found is really helpful is kind of thinking about sort of this notion of the marketplace of ideas and saying like, can we explicitly bring in this kind of like financial metaphor into thinking about like the regulation of these markets? And I've been reading a lot about Keynes and Keynesianism, right? And part of the challenge there was, okay, well, it seems clear that these laissez-faire financial markets just break all the time. At the same time, we don't necessarily want a control economy, right? We don't want to necessarily have the government regulate and come do everything. And so I think the sort of notion of Keynesianism in the marketplace of ideas, I think is a fun way of thinking about it, because there the idea is that markets sometimes get themselves into these self-reinforcing cycles that are really bad, right? And there you want to act forcefully to kind of get us out of that crisis. But once things are functioning again, you sort of want to step away. And I think that's a regulatory approach that looks quite different from the problem and then we're going to patch it, and more a sort of, are there institutions that can take action in times of crisis to kind of get ourselves out of these bad self-reinforcing dynamics, with the notion that we may actually step away once, for example, the health metrics show that the ecosystem is kind of where we want it to be. And so I think there's a lot of different things that we can get thinking about, you know, what is even the kind of like precedent metaphor that we bring to kind of talking about what the public sphere even is.
Terrific. Laura?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that and take it in a slightly different direction, which is in the US context right now, we've seen a lot of different issues around which the private sector has stepped up to take action where the government seems to be unwilling to do so. So one of the things we've seen is in the wake of the Trump administration pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, a whole bunch of businesses stepping up and saying, well, we're actually going to abide by the US commitments to Paris anyways. In the wake of Charlottesville and the horrific violence and hate speech around that, we saw a bunch of companies actually push back on some of the comments from the government around race issues. In the wake of the Parkland shooting, we saw a bunch of companies pull their advertising from the NRA or pull other incentives that are given to the NRA. And you know, we have now seen, particularly for some of the platforms where a lot of their model is based on advertising, we have started to see a couple of advertising groups and advertisers say, if you don't actually start to address this problem in a meaningful way, we may pull our advertising. And if you want to think about market incentives and different ways to bring pressure that aren't the government, that aren't regulation, but are in the marketplace, advertisers actually exerting some leverage in this process could be another vector for that. I just want to also really briefly come back to your question about the role of civil society and pick up on some of Nick's points too here. I mean, I think you know, when we think about the malicious actors in particular, there really is an exploitation of our own vulnerabilities that are our own creation. You know, and the extent that that civil society can really do a lot around, you know, how do we actually come together? How do we reduce polarization, the hyperpartisanship, et cetera? You know, whether that's around specific issues on immigration and race and all these that are being exploited as well. I think that that's also a really, really important role where frankly civil society has to be the driver in that space. And Nick's absolutely right that these are not unrelated, you know, in terms of how these challenges manifest.
Perfect, thank you. Did you go? Yeah.
Well, one of the themes that sort of has emerged in the last few minutes is the idea of public health as a metaphor for what's happening in the space. And one idea is that can we create a system that can respond quickly, just like public health, if there's something going on, can we quickly go in? And the other is to build a healthy system and to be able to measure that. And in fact, that's how I came up with this idea of the trust indicators, because I'm a health science reporter. I thought, well, that's how you look for indicators. And you're looking for indicators of trust in this case because, and it's getting to the civil society point, if we do not trust the information that we're getting from newsmakers, from journalism, how can we have a set of shared facts in order to operate and make decisions about not just our own lives, but our governments and society as a whole? So that's part of this system that I think we can really think about, and I'm glad the idea of indicator is catching on. Trust really is a relationship if you think about it. And that's what's broken, is rebuilding this relationship between the public and the information that they're getting and also the people that are producing it and distributing it to them. And then getting to the actors at the level of civil society, two of our trust indicators kind of get to that, or maybe more than that. But specifically, one is local. So reminding people, and we heard from the public, we want to know when there's a local expertise behind our news. And we want to know when it's coming, when it's relevant to us locally. So that's built in to our system, and it asks larger news organizations to then refer to the local news organizations that they might be gathering news from so that they can, help support that work. Also elevate local expertise. And the other one is engagement. There's a higher expectation we found on the part of the public of actual engagement on the page with news and with the news organization. So that's another way in which I think news organizations can recultivate the responsibility of the public for spreading accurate information instead of misinformation, and that is going in and engaging one-on-one with the communities that you cover. And there's some companies, news organizations that are doing a really good job of that. One is National Public Radio and all the local affiliates. Another is just smaller regional news companies that bring people in, go out in the street and talk to people, not just to gather news, but to find out where people think, where coverage should be going, what are we missing, and how can we cover your community more accurately and fairly?
Thank you. Kelly, any thoughts?
Yeah, three, kind of building off what others has said, I think on the metrics and indicators point, I think this is a really important one, and again, it gets, for me, to the level of, at what level do you want to define these? So there is no way for us to say right now, in 2016, we had this level of sort of disinformation or problematic content, and in 2018, we have X level, and in 2020, there's no way for us to even ask Twitter or Facebook to measure this because we haven't even agreed on how we define in a sort of machine-readable way what this problematic content looks like. And so I think what we've really been focusing on is supporting research, right, to understand, we don't know how broad the problem is, who in particular is being targeted, what kind of impact this information is having on people's political beliefs and values. And I think for the first time in the history that I am aware of, most of this information resides behind corporate paywalls, right? It used to sit at universities, right? Or the government had access to most of the information that tells us what is happening in our society, and that is no longer the case. So I think this point around getting access to the data and doing research to make sure we really understand what the problem looks like is really important before we can get to sensible solutions. I think the second piece that comes up for me is this need to really disaggregate the problem, because I don't think there's going to be a silver bullet here that's going to solve disinformation, right? But that we really need to look at ad tech and bots and microtargeting and ideological bias and uncivil content and start to break these down. And it's at that level that we could start thinking about specific sort of policies or interventions. But at this aggregate level, you're just sort of in this morass. And then I think the third point, which comes back, Connie, to your question about the public sphere and sort of international versus local, is that I think there are going to be really different solutions in different, as I mentioned before, in different geopolitical contexts. And I think a great example is fact-checking, where I was skeptical of its application in the United States. You look, Nick, to your points earlier about the cognitive science here, and once someone is really polarized ideologically around an issue, you're not going to get someone who is really convinced about climate change or vaccines and present them with some new information and change their worldview, right? I mean, the science is quite conclusive that new information doesn't change people's beliefs once they are really polarized. But in a different geopolitical context, or on an issue that's not as polarized, right, that might work. Or you take Germany, I think is a great example, right? They have 50 times the per capita public broadcasting budget of the US. They have a state-mandated history of news literacy, and they have much lower social media penetration. Really different solutions are going to work, I think, in that context than would work in the US context, which I think sort of maps it back to really needing to be proximate to the context that you're working in, because there's not going to be a universal solution, I don't think.
To kind of close this part off, I guess I'm wondering now, like in terms of, do we need a stronger language, perhaps, of data-related rights? Just to be honest, like in terms of, you say access to data, but I was thinking about your market metaphor. I'm really interested in this economic metaphor. I have been turning it over for the past couple of weeks, because in the sense that if you do have some regulation, when do we know when that regulation is invoked, and to what extent do citizens understand what their rights are? What rights do they have? Just trying to think through that more clearly, I think is definitely a challenge before us. So now I'd like to open the floor to questions. And I think there will be a microphone passed around, hopefully. Over there.
Hi, I'm Gillian with Global Witness. So you mentioned digital rights, and I've been really sort of worrying myself about the bots question. I know, for example, Amnesty is now investing in understanding how they can use artificial intelligence and bots to help drive campaigns. So bots could be used for good or ill depending on your values-based perspective. And as we're all aware, the US Supreme Court decided that companies have freedom of speech and that money is a form of speech. So the question becomes, do bots have freedom of speech? And how do we think about bots in the world today? And I'm really, really frightened about the bots. So can you help me understand how we deal with the bots?
So, does anyone like to, Tim, like to try to grapple with the question?
Yeah.
Want to answer that question?
I mean, at least to the question of whether or not bots have freedom of speech, most of the systems that we see sort of being used, right, for these sort of either propaganda campaigns or bots for good, they tend to be actually quite rudimentary at the moment. Like in some ways, the bot language is kind of running away with sort of the kind of science fiction implications of the technology. And so to the extent that bots have speech rights, they're one and the same with those launching bots. Mm-hmm. It gets more complex the more you think about how far this technology will go. So right now, I think if you design the bot, you sort of select what it will say, or even you give it the parameters under which it will select what it will say. That seems like actually pretty straightforward to deal with in terms of our kind of legal analogies about how we deal with the problem. But we're starting to see these kind of machine learning systems that are more autonomous in the sense that they can sort of evolve to try to determine what works, right? So you could say, okay, bot, what we want you to do is just to figure out what drives the most engagement. And we're going to just let you experiment with a bunch of different methods. We're going to kind of close the door and then come back a week later to see where we've been. And there, I think you start to get into more of a legal gray area, but I think it is this kind of big open question. I think in the very least, I think courts, in order to make some of these issues administrable, will almost kind of believe in the fiction of like, you launch it, it's yours, right? But I think that will be kind of an ongoing tension.
Just one quick follow-up. Do you have a right to know if you're talking to a bot?
Right now, I think it's one and the same of whether or not you have the right to know the true identity of a speaker in any case. And so I think there's both the legal aspects of this, like can you kind of subpoena a platform to try to figure out who's behind the bot? But there's also the practicalities of that, which I think make, even if we were to grant that right, there's a lot of limitations in actually executing on it. So right now, I think it's like the existing legal metaphor is what controls rather than bots being kind of their own category.
I'd like to let Nick follow up really quickly, and then I'm going to move Ramesh, actually, maybe next. Thank you.
No, the bot's First Amendment question is a conference favourite. The second part of that question is, are all bots created equal? Which is another legal rabbit hole we can go down. I think there's two problems here. One is that and it was something that Laura touched on earlier, is not looking at what happened 2-3 years ago and thinking that that's the driving problem. The bot space is radically different to how it was 2 or 3 years ago. I think it's really important to look at the evidence about where influence has been exerted, and actually that tends to be people. There is definitely an emergence of cyborg accounts, which are a combination of automated technology and people. But I think a year ago, everything that you disagreed with was, it's fake news. The number of times I see people who are, mainstream politicians from multiple countries whose response to things they disagree with this year is just another Russian bot is really worrying. And I think we've got to this point where the "it's a bot" answer has become the default answer in a lot of situations where actually, if you look at, and I see this every day, humans are actually very bad at spotting bots. Most algorithms to detect them have a margin of error rate around 1/3, if not greater. And so some of the research that's happening here, often on Twitter data because it's the most accessible API from a platform, has become part of the narrative without necessarily being backed up by evidence. And so we have a job as a platform to make sure that the malicious automation is taken off our platform. And we've suspended upwards of 120,000 API keys who were responsible for about 2 billion tweets in 6 months last year. And we catch about 400,000 logins every week that we think are suspicious. We've got to stop those. I think what's dangerous is that not all bots are bad. So there's a bot which tweets out called Tiny Care Bot, which tweets out personal care advice. There's the Wikipedia edit bot, which monitors anonymous edits from Wikipedia from Parliament or Congress. Amnesty did a great bot, which was tweeting about refugee campaigns. And I think there's a danger that we've kind of decided the problem is bots, all bots are bad, and anything that looks vaguely like I disagree with it is a Russian bot, and we definitely need to step back from that, because I don't think it's helping find solutions, and it's also, in some ways, helping bad actors who have already changed their methods anyway.
Great. Next question here. Right there. Thank you.
I appreciate those responses on bots and kind of giving us a more finer grained way of thinking about them. And also, I would just remind us that it's not equivalent exactly, but about 10, 15 years ago, we were all really concerned about spam. And actually, we've done quite a bit to kind of diminish that as a problem. So my question is really about trying to situate this larger conversation against a backdrop where peoples in relation to kind of various forms of populism have increasingly shown a distrust in institutions, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for not. And as a result, I think that's one factor. And then a second factor is sort of the larger ecology of media pre-existing the internet, namely the expansion of television channels and channels more generally from, dozens to hundreds, if not thousands, and sort of the larger distrust of people in media and institutions itself, knowing fully well that based on one's sort of political leaning, we may not exactly trust Fox News, or I'll just speak for myself. And so as a result, there's a certain type of embedded sense that our media ecologies, even if I don't consider the internet itself, are not necessarily pro-public, they're not serving the public. And perhaps that is partly why we went online, to see what our friends have to say on Facebook and be okay with data-oriented targeting with economic kinds of concerns, right? So I just want to kind of situate it against this kind of larger backdrop of an absence of trust in institutions and networks that seem disconnected on a political economy level from people and users.
Good.
So just thoughts on that.
Terrific, thank you. Could I ask Sally and Laura if you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so of course, I think that's such an important problem, and trust in news has been declining, as I said, for quite some time. We've been contending with that. It is something where when I talk about the Trust Project and when I think about our goals, it's about building a more trusted and trustworthy press, because there are a couple of elements there. One is that journalism does have distinct values and practices that and we need to pull back the curtain on that so people understand what true, honest journalism really is about and hold journalists accountable to that, number one. And then number two, I think you're quite right that people, as they've lost trust in the news, have gone elsewhere to find information. And one of them, and in fact, that kind of goes again, I know that we do tend to look for kind of shelter in our filter bubbles, but we also learn from members of the public that they really want to break out of that too. So we heard lots of people saying we want to hear from people like ourselves in the news because we don't feel represented, and we want to hear from people unlike ourselves, and really calling upon the media to do a better job in that realm.
Yeah, I think the loss of trust in government as well is a really big challenge in this space. Comment earlier about the absence of sort of strategic messaging, public diplomacy from governments creates this void for others to do ill. The problem, though, is if government sort of puts out messages in some contexts, they're not even trusted in the first place. And so I think that creates real challenges for the role of government in this sphere. One paradox, though, that's interesting to me is there's a member of Congress from Texas who had this great saying I'm going to borrow, is basically his line is, we need to teach our kids about the new stranger danger. So, kids growing up would learn, don't get in a van with a stranger, don't take candy from a stranger, yet somehow in our sort of online environment, we trust what is being shared by a complete stranger, just because it confirms our underlying bias, actually. And so being a discriminating user of, again, this congressman called it the new stranger danger. We need to teach our kids, and it's not just kids, by the way. In many cases, a lot of the data shows that it's those who are newer to who didn't grow up with the internet, actually, who are most vulnerable. And so trust, I think, is a really important concept in a number of different ways, where we do trust, where we don't, and the implications that has for solutions.
Another question, this gentleman right here. Yes, I know that you've been.
Are you concerned about the possibility that you're proposing a medicine that actually, or a cure that might be worse than the disease? Because what I'm hearing, and again, this is my own filter, I may be insane, but boiled down to it, what I'm hearing is that there are ideas and beliefs out there that you don't like, and you're trying to find some way to suppress them. And historically, whenever that's been attempted, it's in the long run had the opposite effect of what was desired. There's a truism that the antidote to a bad idea is good ideas. The phenomenon that we're seeing now is not a new phenomenon, it's just manifested in a different way. There have always been ideas that disinformation, propaganda, before it was done through leaflets or whatever, but again, revolutions have been fought over the attempts to suppress these sorts of things. So, is it not better perhaps just to try to expand the amount to which positive, good information is out there, but keeping in mind that trying to suppress things we dislike may in fact just encourage their promulgation. And there are elements in place for things like incentives to violence that are illegal, and that's actually an area that I'm more concerned about on something like Twitter than a bot. I don't think people actually vote on the basis of some tweet from someone they've never seen before. But there are terrorist organizations like Hamas which have actually organized actions where people have died, and through their Twitter account. So I think that's something that's serious and needs to be looked at.
That's a huge question. Kelly, do you have any thoughts?
So I think that is the question that everyone is wrestling with, is the cure going to be worse than the disease, right? And I think that's why, at least on our part, we've been saying we need a lot more research. We actually come at this from a position of not advocating for any particular cure, outside of the fact that I do think there needs to be some responsibility on the part of the platforms, both because it is a much clearer pathway to intervention than trying to change the behaviors of hundreds of newsrooms or hundreds of millions of news consumers, and because this is the newest change to our information ecosystem. But I think it is totally unclear what the solution is, to me. And we sat down and interviewed, I guess it was almost a year and a half ago now, something like 60 experts around the world on this topic, and what came back was an overwhelming lack of consensus about what the right solution is. So I don't think there is a cure on the table that is going. I do think some governments, if you look at what the GDPR, I think that's concerning to me, coming from an American context. You look at what Singapore and other countries have been considering. I think that there are those risks. Yeah.
Nick, and then Tim.
No, I totally agree. I think one of the dangers in this space as well is, strangely, at a time of populism, it's also made the policy responses to global challenges more insular. So we spend our time talking about what could the UK government do, the French government, the American Congress, and no one's really talking about in internet governance globally and how that's changing around Africa. So the WSIS last time round had an actual vote, and it came down on the multi-stakeholder model, but not by a long way. And since then, we haven't really discussed global internet governance. And individual governments are doing their own thing, and the danger is that you chip away at global norms in enough places, and the next time we have a big global discussion, you lose entire continents to a Russia-China model of information governance, which is much less based on the values that we hold. So I think the maxim kind of, legislate in haste, repent at leisure is definitely true here. One thing we do not want to do as platforms is be arbiters of truth. We said that aggressively. I said that very directly in a DC hearing several times. We do not want to take stuff down because it's untrue. Because the idea that it's a binary choice every time is totally wrong. What we need to do is, as you say, right now, something that really concerns us is the abuse of journalists. So actually the people who are trying to put credible information out into the ecosystem being harassed off the platform by people who are acting not to spread their own information, but just to silence those people who are spreading information. And I think, you look at what's happened to Rappler as a great example of why that's really important to stop. So abuse for us is important. Making sure bad actors are off our platform based on our existing rules. Those of you who may have seen, we did a blog posting last week about how we respond in the aftermath of major public events, summarizing how we use our abuse rules, our existing private information rules, to stop people trying to pollute an information system after an incident. We have lots of rules we can enforce without basing it on ideology, content, truth, and I think that's the line that we as platforms need to be very careful of crossing, because there's no algorithm in the world that isn't biased.
Sure, I mean, I think, so I totally agree, because I think it's worth always kind of keeping top of mind in some of these discussions, sort of the lurking, sinister feeling that, like, the underlying message of a lot of these discussions is surely if they had more information, they would come to agree with us, right? And I think that's something that is worth keeping in mind, and we need to find sort of approaches that kind of avoid those types of intellectual commitments. And I guess I think a little bit about kind of like not so much the truth or falsity, but you can almost think about it in terms of a balance of power, right? Like, what is the relative cost of producing misinformation versus verifying misinformation? And in a world where it's a lot more costly to do one and the other, you get these kind of imbalances that we might feel uncomfortable with that have a little bit less to do with whether or not a particular set of people in a population agree with your particular worldview. I think even with that in mind, though, there's a lot of empirical research to be done on avoiding these unintentional side effects. One anecdote I really like is there's this paper by Gordon Pennycook and David Rand on basically whether or not labeling fake news does anything, right? And they look at it and they say, okay, we show these people these verifications. And one of the interesting results is basically that for all the sort of fake news that you do label, obviously the credibility goes down. People see the label and they say, oh, well, it's been labeled, I won't trust it as much. But part of the unintentional side effects is all the fake news that you fail to label actually has an implied truth effect. You actually believe it more, right? And so you can imagine these sort of situations where we kind of implement these incomplete solutions that actually drive us much more further down the chain, or end up with these results that actually initiate another set of conferences for us to talk about these issues. So.
Another question. I'm so sorry. No, there's so many wonderful questions. Sir.
One of the realities of having ethics in the topic focuses us both on the negative standards we're trying to create. We don't want sources of news to violate certain kinds of norms. You all talked about solutions that had that negative consequence. We talked just briefly about positive attempts to create whether we call it virtue or commitment amongst the users to truth, civility, whatever. I just wondered if there are examples that you could point to of attempts to do that as the other side of ethics, which is the aspiration rather than the minimum standard.
I can throw out one fun one. On the question of bots, actually, the Kevin Munger's Good Bots study, if anyone knows and loves this study, which was basically he wanted to see if he could shame people into being more civil online. He's a scholar at NYU, and basically set up a cohort of good bots that anytime someone would say something that was sort of racially charged or uncivil, the good bots would then go out and shame them. And then he tested which kinds of profiles of good bots would have a stronger shaming effect. And it turned out that it was in-group ideology and in-group race. So white men, Republicans would listen to white male Republicans, African-American women would be more shamed by African-American women, and so forth. And so I think it sort of illustrates Nick's point around, bots, A, it was 2 or 3 years ago was the biggest concern, and B, it's very complex when they are good or bad, and it's an arms race, right? It's getting harder and harder as the technology improves. It's harder and harder to actually, to Tim's point, to detect bots, even the bad ones, and perhaps especially the bad ones.
Another question. Yes, you, right there. Yeah. Sarah.
Hi, thank you. I work at YouTube, so we grapple with this pretty regularly, another platform. I do wonder, though, one of the things that we are always grappling with is our responsibility to give the user what they want. In many cases, they want bad information or misinformation versus giving the user appropriate context information. So we've made those kind of decisions in certain situations where they're looking for information around self-harm or something. Obviously, we try not to surface that kind of content to them. But in other cases where it seems more innocuous, like flat earth theory or something like that, what do you feel is the responsibility of the platforms to engage or disengage when people are actively seeking that information?
Any thoughts? I mean, of course, we have two people who can talk to platforms, but also just more generally. I mean, I know that I want to see my fuzzy cats when I want to see them, so.
Well, I'll just, were you about to say?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say that's a problem that journalism has faced forever. So making decisions about what do we offer the public when we know that there's always the desire for gossip or for negative news. How do we balance that out and cultivate an environment that enriches people and cultivate an environment where people want enrichment? And so I guess I don't think we've found the answer other than balance. And also I think often we tend to underestimate the public. That's one of my, people really do. Like when we went out and talked to people, they do want to be informed. And yes, they like their cat videos, or the other thing that came up with these editors is police mugshots. They found that people would click on police mugshots over and over and over again so they could see who'd been arrested. Well, there's that inclination, but if we can balance it out, not so much with the vegetables, but with all the wonderful culinary delights that are out there and information. And again, that gets to human intervention on the decision makers on YouTube or wherever, whoever is serving up information.
So with that, our session is at an end. I would like to thank all of our wonderful panelists for their thoughts, and I'm sure they'd love to continue the conversation afterwards, but thank you too for coming.